According to Incan history and mythology, there first existed the creator god known as Viracocha, who made the sun and moon and the heavens, and created man by breathing life into the earth. These first humans were a race of brutish giants who displeased Viracocha by disobeying him, so he eventually destroyed them with torrential rains and massive floods, turning many of them to stone as well. And they say the remnants of these giants can still be seen at places like Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. After this, Viracocha created a new people to inhabit the land. He went deep below the earth's surface and created 4 sons to rule over this new humanity. Eventually, he sent these sons and their families to the earth's surface to venerate the sun god and create a great empire. The story goes that these first inhabitants emerged from 3 caves on a massive hill called Tampu Tocco, meaning hole or gap in the wall. Today, it's also the modern word for window. Here, the brothers created a great city that was recognizable by a large tavern with 3 windows facing the rising sun. The windows represented the caves from which the brothers emerged, and we find this exact feature atop Machu Picchu, leading many scholars, including Hiram Bingham, the modern discoverer of the site, to believe that Machu Picchu is the location of the mythological city of Tampu Tocco. Eventually, this valley became too small for these men and their families, so they set off on a journey to find more fertile land. The legend goes that one of these brothers was convinced to go back down into the caves, and that's when they closed up the way behind him and sealed the 3 caves forever. On their journey to find new land, they came across a giant stone idol from a civilization long past. One of the 3 brothers venerated the idol, while the others chose not to. These 2 brothers who chose to ignore the idol were subsequently turned to stone. When the group finally reached their destination, only one of the brothers remained. Here he took his golden staff and sunk it deep into the land, signifying the founding of the Incan civilization and their capital of Cusco. And nobody has ever found this golden staff. Some say it still lies deep in the earth, below the center of Cusco. In the year 1911, the American explorer Hiram Bingham set out to discover this lost city of Tampu Tocco. He ventured deep into the most remote and inaccessible regions of the Peruvian jungle, being guided by locals who knew of several different ancient sites that laid in ruins. Bingham details this journey in his book written in 1913 titled In the Wonderland of Peru. In this book, he faces danger along every step of the journey, from disease and death in the city of Cusco to treacherous river crossings and death-defying mountain climbs. He speaks of finding megalithic structures from a civilization long forgotten, and he speaks of treasures of gold and silver. Many of his men, including him, were injured along the way, but they did eventually make it to Machu Picchu. Bingham wrote this on his first day in Machu Picchu. Leaving camp soon after breakfast, I joined the guide, and accompanied by a soldier that had been kindly loaned to me by the Peruvian government, plunged through the jungle to the riverbank, and came to a shaky little bridge made of 4 tree trunks, bound together with vines and stretching across a stream only a few inches above the roaring rapids. On the other side, we had a hard climb, first through the jungle and later up a very stiff, almost precipitous slope. About noon, we reached a little grass hut, where a good-natured Indian family who had been living there for 3 or 4 years gave us welcome and set before us gourds full of cool, delicious water and a few cold-boiled sweet potatoes. Apart from another hut in the vicinity and a few stone-faced terraces, there seemed to be little in the way of ruins, and I began to think that my time had been wasted. However, the view was magnificent, the water was delicious, and the shade of the hut was most agreeable. So we rested a while, then went to the top of the ridge. On all sides of us rose magnificent peaks of the Urubamba Canyon, while 2,000 feet below us the rushing waters from the noisy river, making a great turn, defending 3 sides of the ridge, on top of which we were hunting for ruins. On the west side of the ridge, the 3 Indian families who had chosen this eagle's nest for their home had built a little path, part of which consisted of crude ladders and vines, and tree trunks tied to the face of the precipice. Presently, we found ourselves in the midst of a tropical forest, beneath the shade of whose trees we could make out a maze of ancient walls, the ruins of buildings made of blocks of granite, some of which were beautifully fitted together in the most refined style of Incan architecture. A few rods farther along, we came to a little open space, on which were 2 splendid temples or palaces. The superior character of the stonework, the presence of these splendid edifices, and of what appeared to be an unusually large number of finely constructed stone dwellings, led me to believe that Machu Picchu might prove to be the largest and most important ruin discovered in South America since the days of the Spanish conquest. Bingham also acknowledged that he was not the first explorer here. In his library of photos, there's one of a brick at Machu Picchu with the date of 1902. This was credited to the explorer Agustin Lizarraga, and some have even claimed to have been there earlier than that. Here's a German map from 1874 showing Machu Picchu and its neighboring peak, Huayna Picchu. The discovery of Machu Picchu remains one of the most important to understand Incan history, for the simple fact that it was so well preserved from the Spanish invaders and later governments, due to its remote location and inaccessibility. The Incan emperors knew this, and it was one of the main reasons they inhabited it. When the Spanish arrived and took over Cusco, the people of Machu Picchu fled the area, and they destroyed any road or trail that led into the remote valley where Machu Picchu and Huayna Picchu are located. They willingly left their homes and fled so the site would be preserved. And some say they were also trying to hide a great treasure that still has yet to be found. But the fact remains that the actions these last Incan residents of Machu Picchu took saved the site from pillaging and preserved it for us to see today. This has created a real possibility for the existence of treasure, and every explorer and archaeologist to excavate the site has thought of this possibility. Bingham himself did turn up some gold and silver artifacts. However, there's a story of a golden artifact that belonged to one of the last emperors of the Incan Empire, whose tomb has never been located. The emperor was named Pachacuti, and he ruled from 1438 to 1471 AD. He was said to have come to power due to a divine connection to the creator god Viracocha. Viracocha was said to have spoken to him through a golden mirror where Pachacuti could view the very face of the god. This mirror was most likely buried with Pachacuti, but his mummy has never been found. However, in 2011, researchers located a collapsed entryway into a void or room at Machu Picchu. Scanning showed there to be a large room with both ferrous and non-ferrous metals in it. However, UNESCO bars anyone from excavating anything at the site, so nobody's allowed to do any further research. This room could be the missing tomb of Pachacuti and contain his magical golden mirror. He was known to have used these mountains as a residence, as did many Incan rulers. Unfortunately, there's no way to legally get to the bottom of this mystery at this time. However, we do have thousands of artifacts already recovered from Machu Picchu, many of which are made of gold and silver and also bronze. So any number of things could exist in this hidden chamber. Many of these artifacts are incredible and show how advanced and mysterious the Incan people truly were. Archaeologists have also uncovered elongated skulls in this area, along with several other sites around Peru. But the most impressive thing found at Machu Picchu is the architecture itself. Some of the largest and heaviest granite stones were used in the creation of this city. Not only did the structures incorporate these giant stones, but they actually fit them together so precisely and shaped them so perfectly that they didn't need any mortar at all. Just extremely large rocks fit tightly together in some of the oddest shapes in some areas. We have no idea how they got these stones up the summit, or how they cut these giant blocks of granite. Granite's one of the most dense and most difficult types of stone to work with. Their level of masonry was more advanced than anything we could even do today, only matched by a small number of other ancient cultures in pockets around the world. We have no idea how they learned these techniques, and we have no idea why they built this way. But we see it all over Peru and into Bolivia. Giant megalithic stone structures and walls that look like something built by ancient Egyptians or ancient Hindu peoples. Bingham himself called it Cyclopean architecture. We also see pyramids along the Peruvian coastal regions, giant geoglyphs at Nazca and some other places, elongated skulls, some of which are missing the sagittal suture and contain more mass in the skull than normal humans. We have the giant H blocks at Pumapunku that were created with such precision the lines are all perfectly parallel with each other, and the edges are as sharp as a razor blade. Or what about the unexplained band of holes? There was something very mysterious about the ancient Peruvian people. Bingham spoke of this ancient civilization in his book. He wrote, "A story told to some of the early Spanish chroniclers in regard to that distant historical event runs somewhat as follows. Thousands of years ago there lived in the highlands of Peru a megalithic folk who developed a remarkable civilization and who left, as architectural records, such cyclopean structures as the fortresses of Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo. These people were attacked by barbarian hordes coming from the south, possibly from the Argentine Pampas. They were defeated and fled into the most inaccessible Andean canyons. Here, in a region strongly defended by nature, they established themselves. Here their descendants lived for several centuries. The chief place was called Tampu Tocco. Eventually regaining their military strength and becoming crowded in this mountainous valley, they left Tampu Tocco, and under the leadership of 3 brothers went out of these 3 windows, or caves, and started for Cusco. The migration was slow and deliberate. They eventually reached Cusco, and there they established the Inca kingdom, which through several centuries spread by conquest over the entire plateau, and even as far south as Chile and as far north as Ecuador. This Inca empire had reached its height when the Spaniards came. The Spaniards were told that the Tampu Tocco was a place called Pacari Tampu, a small village a day's journey southwest of Cusco, and in the Apurimae Valley. The chroniclers duly noted this location, that Tampu Tocco was at Pacari Tampu. The existence of this advanced civilization is obvious when you look at the structures they built. These were buildings on par with that of the Great Pyramids, Stonehenge, the Great Ziggurats, and the pyramids of Mesoamerica to the north. But we have none of their records or histories, just stories from the Incan people and what remains in the archaeological record. Bingham continues his death-defying story about what he finds at Machu Picchu and the search for lost treasure. It reads, "On the first day I had set fire to the cane in order to clear the trail. This fire did not clear much, however. On the second day I was about a quarter of a mile behind the workmen, or rather above them, when suddenly Tomas, the Peruvian soldier, who was with me, said, 'Look, they have fired the cane.' Sure enough, they had started it, and in a minute it had gained headward and was roaring up towards us, the flames reaching 15 or 20 feet into the air. There was nothing for us but to run, and we did that, tearing through the jungle downhill in an effort to get around the side of the fire. Suddenly, on one of my jumps I didn't stop when I expected to, but kept right on through the air. The brush had masked but a nice little 8-foot jump off, and I got beautifully bumped. In a minute there came a thump, and Tomas landed beside me. It amused me so much to watch him that I forgot all about my own jolted bones. There was nothing broken, however, and we made our way without much trouble around the fire and fell upon the peons, who were gathered in a bunch, speculating as to where we might be. 3 days later I reached Machu Picchu in company with Dr. Eaton. Our osteologist and Mr. Erdis, who was an archaeological engineer, was to have general work of clearing and excavating the ruins. Mr. Heald was at once relieved from the further duty at Machu Picchu, where he had just begun the work of clearing, and was asked to see whether he could get to the top of the neighboring peak, and investigate the story that there were magnificent ruins upon its summit. The same Indian who had originally told me about the ruins at Machu Picchu had repeatedly declared that those on Huayna Picchu were only slightly inferior. Mr. Heald's report of his work on Huayna Picchu runs in part as follows. Huayna Picchu, lying to the north of Machu Picchu and connected with it by a narrow neck, rises some 2,500 feet above the Urubamba River. On one side, the south, this elevation is reached by what is practically one complete precipice. On the other, while there are sheer ascents, there are also slopes, and according to the account of one Arteaga, who claims to have explored the forest, which cover a good deal of it, was once cultivated, and the slopes being converted into level fields by low earth terraces. This mountain is, like Machu Picchu, cut from medium-grained gray to red granite, which accounts in parts for its sharp, craggy outlines. The lower slopes, where there are any, are covered with forest growths of large trees. A peculiar thing in this connection is one solitary palm tree, which rises above the other vegetation. Near the top, the large trees give place to cane and mesquite, while many slopes have nothing but grass. This last is due more to steepness than the lack of soil, than to any peculiarity of elevation or location, however. My first trip to reach the summit of Huayna Picchu, and to ascertain what ruins, if any, were on it, ended in failure. The only man who had been up, who lives at Mandor Pampa, was drunk, and refused to go with me, so I decided to try to find a way without his help. I knew where his bridge crossed the Urubamba River, and where he had started up when he went a year before me. With these two things to help me, I thought I could very likely find as much as he had. The river was passed easily on the rather shaky 4-pole bridge, and we started up the slope, cutting steps as we went, for it was almost vertical. We seldom had to cut steps for more than 20 to 30 feet on a stretch. The greatest hindrance was the cane and long grass, through which it was hard to cut away with the machetes. Our progress, slow at first, got absolutely snail-like as the men got tired. So, getting impatient, I resolved to push on alone, telling them to follow the marks of my machete, and charging Tomas to see that they made good trail and did not loaf. I pushed on up the hill, clearing my way with the machete, stopping occasionally to open my shirt at the throat and cool off, as it was terribly hot. The brush through which I made my way was in great part mesquite, terribly tough and with heavy, strong thorns. If a branch was not cut through at one blow, it was pretty sure to come whipping back and drive half a dozen spikes into hands, arms, and bodies. Luckily, I had had enough practice to learn how to strike with a heavy shoulder blow, but I didn't get away untouched by any means. Finally, about 3 p.m., I had almost gained the top of the lowest part of the ridge, which runs along like the back plates of some spined dinosaur. The trees had given way to grass or bare rock, the face of the rock being practically vertical. A cliff some 200 feet high stood in my way. By going out to the end of the ridge, I thought that I could look almost straight down to the river, which looked more like a trout brook than a river at a distance, though its roar in the rapids came up distinctly. I was just climbing out on top of the lowest back plate when the grass and soil under my feet let go, and I dropped. For almost 20 feet. There was a slope of about 70 degrees and then a jump of about 200 feet, after which it would be bump and repeat down the river. As I shot down the sloping surface, I reached out with my right hand and grabbed a mesquite brush that was growing in a crack about 5 feet above the jump off. I was going so fast that it jerked my arm up, and as my body was turning, pulled me from my side to my face. Also, the jerk broke the ligaments holding the outer ends of the clavicle and scapula together. The strength left the arm with the tearing loose of the ligaments, but I had checked enough to give me a chance to get a hold of a branch with my left hand. After hanging for a moment or two, so as to look everything over and be sure that I did nothing wrong, I started to work back up. The hardest part was to get my feet on the trunk of the little tree. The fact that I was wearing moccasins instead of boots helped a great deal here, as they would take hold of the rock, and it was distressingly slow work, but after about half an hour I had gotten back to comparatively safe footing. As my right arm was almost useless, I at once made my way down, getting back to the camp at about 5:30. Taking the workmen with me as I went. On this trip I saw no sign of Inca work, except the one small ruined wall. 5 days later, Mr. Heel judged that his arm was in sufficiently good shape so that he could continue the work, and he very pluckily made another attempt to reach the top of Huaynu Picchu. This likewise ended his failure, but on the following day he returned to the attack, followed his old trail up 1,700 feet, and guided by the same half-breed who had told us about the ruins, eventually reached the top. His men were obligated to cut steps into the steep slope for a part of the distance, until they came to some of the stone stairs, which led them practically to the summit. The top consisted of a jumbled mass of granite boulders about 2,500 feet above the river. There were no houses, though there were several flights of steps, and 3 little caves. No family could have wished to live there. It might have been a signal station. After Mr. Heald had left Machu Picchu, we set ourselves to see whether excavation in the principal structures would lead to the discovery of any shards or artifacts. It did not take us long to discover that there were pot shards outside of and beneath the outer walls of several of the important structures. But our digging inside the walls of the principal temples was almost without any results whatsoever. We did find that the floor of the principal temple had been carefully made of a mixture of granite, gravel, and sand, and clay, laid on top of small stones, and these again on top of a mass of granite rocks and boulders. When the temple was in use, this clean white floor must have been an attractive feature. Our workmen excavated with will, for the test made with a crowbar gave such resounding hollow sounds that they felt sure there was treasure to be found beneath the floor of the ancient temple. In places, the excavation was carried to a depth of 8 or 9 feet, and practically the entire floor of the temple was excavated to a depth of 3 or 4 feet. But all this back-breaking work ended in only disappointment. There were many crevices and holes between the boulders under the floor, but nothing in them, not even a bone or a pot shard. Digging in the temple of the 3 windows had a similar negative result, but digging outside on the terrace below the 3 windows resulted in a large quantity of decorated pot shards. Most of them were 2 to 4 feet under the surface. It seems as though it had been custom for a long period of time to throw earthenware out the window of this edifice. At the end of a week of hard and continuous labor, we had not succeeded in finding a single skull, a single burial cave, nor any pieces of bronze or pots worth mentioning. We did not like to resort to the giving of prizes at such an early stage. A day or two spent in hunting over the mountainside with the Indians for burial caves, yielding no results. We finally offered a prize of 1 soul, 50 cents in gold, to any workman who would report the whereabouts of a cave containing a skull, and who would leave the cave exactly as he found it, allowing us to see the skull actually in position. The next day all the workmen were allowed to follow their own devices, and they started out early on a feverish hunt for burial caves. The half-dozen worthies whom we had brought with us from Cusco returned at the end of the day tattered and torn, sadder and no wiser. They had hewed their way through the jungle. One of them had cut open his big toe with his machete. Their clothes were in shreds, and they had found nothing. But the Indians who lived in the vicinity, and who had undoubtedly engaged in treasure hunting before, responded nobly to the offer of a prize, and came back at the end of the day with the story that they had discovered not 1, but 8 burial caves. This was the beginning of a highly successful effort to locate and collect the skeletal remains of the ancient inhabitants of Machu Picchu. 52 graves in and near the ancient city were excavated by Dr. Eaton, our osteologist. The greatest number of these graves were in caves under large boulders and projecting ledges of the mountainside. And the method usually followed by the osteologist in exploring them was first to photograph the entrance of the cave from without, after which the grave was opened and its contents carefully removed. Measurements were taken and diagrams were made to show the positioning of the human skeletons and the arrangement of the accompanying pottery, implements, ornaments, and bones of lower animals. In a few instances, it was possible to photograph the interiors of the graves. In some of the caves, only fragmentary skeletal remains were found. In others, only larger bones and a skull or two, while others contained not only nearly complete skeletons, but pots in more or less perfect state of preservation, and occasionally pieces of bronze. In this way, a large and valuable collection was made of human skeletons, pottery, and other artifacts of various materials, including some of the tools probably used by the Inca or pre-Inca stonemasons in the more intricate parts of their work. Before dismissing the subject of the ancient graves, it may be noted that the custom seems to have been, whenever possible, to bury the dead in the sitting position, with the knees raised. In very few instances, the bodies were interred in crudely fashioned bottle-shaped graves. The burial caves occur generally on one side of the mountain below the ruins, as they are in well-nigh inaccessible locations and more or less covered with dense tropical jungle. The work of visiting and excavating them was extremely arduous, and it is most highly to the credit of those engaged in it that so many caves were opened and so much material gathered. It is too early yet to give any generalizations with regard to the anatomical characteristics of the Machu Picchu people. A few of the skulls show decided marks of artificial deformation, but most of them are normal. Mr. Erdis eventually made the discovery that by digging at least 18 inches underground at the mouths of small caves under large boulders, within 200 yards of the 3 willow temples, he was almost sure to find 1 or 2 articles of bronze, either pins, tweezers, pendants, or other ornaments. The nature of the more interesting finds can be better understood by the accompanying photographs. It is most sincerely to be hoped that the Peruvian government will not allow the ruins to be overgrown with a dense forest, as they have been in the past. Although the buildings are extremely well built, there is no cement or mortar in the masonry, and there is no means of preventing the roots of the forest trees from penetrating the walls and eventually tearing them all down. In several cases we found gigantic trees perched on the very tips of the gable ends of small and beautifully constructed houses. It was not the least difficult part of our work to cut down and get such trees out of the way without seriously damaging the house walls. Considering the pains that we took to preserve the ruins from further spoliation by the dense vegetation, it was with frank and painful surprise that we read in the decree issued by the new Peruvian government, in connection with giving us permission to take out of Peru what we had found, a clause stating that we were not to injure the ruins in the slightest, and that we must neither deface nor mutilate them. I could not help being reminded of the fact that we had spent 2 days of one workman's time in erasing from the beautiful granite walls the crude charcoal autographs of visiting Peruvians, one of whom had taken the pains to scrawl in huge letters his name in 33 places in the principal and most attractive buildings. We were greatly aided in the work of clearing the ruins by having with us for 2 months Lieutenant Sotomayor of the Peruvian army. Lieutenant Sotomayor took personal charge of the gang of Indians engaged in clearing the jungle and drying and burning the rubbish. As long as he was allowed to remain with us, he did his work most faithfully and efficiently. It was with regret that we found he was relieved from his duty at Machu Picchu in September. Although it is too early to speak definitively in regard to the civilization of Machu Picchu, a short description of the principal characteristics of the city may not be out of place. Machu Picchu is essentially a city of refuge. It's perched on a mountaintop in the most inaccessible corner of the most inaccessible section of the Urubamba River. So as far as I know, there is no part of the Andes that has been better defended by nature. A stupendous canyon where the principal rock is granite, and where the precipices are frequently over 1,000 feet sheer, presents difficulties of attack and facilities for defense second to none. Since they had no iron or steel tools, only stone hammers, Its construction must have cost many generations, if not centuries of effort. Across the ridge and defending the boulders from attack on the side of the main mountain range, they constructed 2 walls. One of them constitutes the outer line of defense, leading from precipice to precipice, utilizing as best it can the natural steepness of the hill. Beyond this and on top of the mountain called Machu Picchu, which overlooks the valley from the very summit of one of the most stupendous precipices in the canyon, is constructed a single station, from which the approach of an enemy could be instantly communicated to the city below. Within the outer wall, they constructed an extensive series of agricultural terraces, stone-lined and averaging about 8 feet. Between these and the city is a steep, dry moat and the inner wall. When members of an attacking force had safely negotiated the precipitous and easily defended sides of the moat, they would still find themselves outside the inner defense of the city, which consisted of walls from 15 to 20 feet high, composed of the largest stones that could be found in the vicinity. Many of them were huge boulders weighing many tons. Inside the city, the houses are crowded and close together, but an extensive system of narrow streets and rock-hewn stairways made intercommunication comfortable and easy. On entering the city, perhaps the first characteristic that strikes one is that a large majority of the houses were a story and a half in height, with gable ends, and these gable ends are marked by cylindrical blocks, projecting out from the houses in such a way as to suggest the idea of the ends of the rafters. The wooden rafters have all disappeared, but the ring stones to which they were tied may still be seen in some of the pictures. The next most conspicuous feature of Machu Picchu is the quantity of stairways, there being over 100 large and small within the city. Some of them have more than 150 steps, while others have about 3 or 4. In some cases, each step is a single block of stone 3 or 4 feet wide. In others, the entire stairway is 6, 8, or 10 steps. Again, the stairway would seem almost fantastic, being so narrow and wedged in between 2 boulders so close together that it would have been impossible for a fat man to use the stairway at all. In no cases were stairways intended for ornament. In every case, they were useful in getting to a location, otherwise difficult to access. The largest level space in the city was carefully graded and terraced, so as to be used for agricultural purposes, on the products of which the inhabitants could fall back for a time in case of siege. It seems probable that one reason why the city was deserted was a change in climate, resulting in scarcity of water supply. At the present time, there are only 3 springs on the mountainside, and in the dry season these springs barely furnish water enough for cooking and drinking purposes for 40 or 50 people. There could never have been very much water here, for the water channels are narrower than any we have ever seen anywhere else, being generally less than 4 inches in width. We were able to trace the principal water channels from the vicinity of the springs along the mountainside for a distance of perhaps a mile, across the dry moat on a slender bridge, then under the city walls along one of the terraces, and finally to the first series of fountains, or baths, located on the principal stairway of the city. The stairway is divided to admit the entrance of one of the fountains, of which there are 14 or 15 in the series. Each basin is about 2.5 feet long by 1.5 feet wide, and from 5 to 6 inches in depth. In some cases, the basin and the floor of the bathhouse, or fountain, is made of a single slab of granite. Generally, holes were drilled into one of the corners of the basin to permit the water to flow through carefully cut underground channels to the next basin below. The Peruvians call these fountains baths. It does not seem to me likely that they were used for this purpose, but rather that by a carefully husbanding in basins in this sort, the water pots of the inhabitants can more readily be filled by anyone coming to one of these fountains. Many of these houses are built on terraces on the steep sloping hillsides. In such cases, their doors face the hill and the windows look out on the view. Most of the houses are well provided with niches, the average size being about 2 feet in height and 1.25 feet in width. And some interiors projecting cylindrical blocks are found alternating between the niches. In a few houses we found evidence of stucco, but in most cases the mud plaster had entirely disappeared. The difficulties of life for several centuries in the Vilcabamba region would have been likely to have developed this ingenious and extremely capable race and given them strength of character. The influence of geographical environment is no small factor in developing racial characteristics. I hope at no distant future to prepare an exhaustive report of this wonderful city, whose charm can only be dimly realized from these pictures. The beautiful blue of the tropical sky, the varying shades of green that clothe the magnificent mountains, and the mysterious charm of the roaring rapids, thousands of feet below, cannot be portrayed, and can with difficulty be imagined. The beautiful panoramic view of Machu Picchu which accompanies this article as a supplement gives a good idea of the Grand Canyon of Urubamba as seen from Machu Picchu. It is still too early to make definite statements in regard to the importance of this discovery. In fact, such opinions can only be passed by archaeological experts after the full report of the work at Machu Picchu has been prepared and published. This much, however, can be said in regard to the superiority in extent and interest of Machu Picchu over previously discovered Inca ruins. The most important Inca ruins heretofore discovered are in the city of Cusco, the town and fortress of Ollantaytambo, Pisac, and on the islands of Lake Titicaca. There are besides these on the coast a number of locations like Pachacamac, Nazca, Incan, Trujillo, and the country of Gran Chimu, where the chief interest lies in the extensive findings of mummies, pottery, textiles, and metal ornaments including gold, silver, bronze, etc. All of these places, however, were known to the Spanish conquerors, and have been ransacked by treasure hunters from the earliest times. Cusco, the most important place of all, was adopted by the Spaniards as their most important city outside of Lima. They entirely remade the city using large quantities of the ancient Inca walls to build their own palaces and churches. Although the city still has many Inca remains and retains a great charm for the tourists and the archaeological students, it is more of a Spanish colonial city than that of an Inca city. The same is partly true of Ollantaytambo, the ruins of Pisac, and many others in the vicinity, of which is not necessary to give an account here, however repeatedly ransacked by treasure hunters. The Long Palace at Vitcos, identified in 1911 as the last Inca capital, has been almost completely destroyed by these treasure hunters. Of the 30 beautiful door-cut granites, only 2 of the 3 remain. On the other hand, Machu Picchu not only is larger and contains more edifices than any other ruin discovered in Peru, except Cusco, it has the additional advantage of not having been known to the Spaniards, of not having been occupied by their descendants, and of not having been torn to pieces by treasure hunters seeking within the walls for gold and silver ornaments that were not to be found in the floors. In other words, Machu Picchu is not only more extensive than any previously discovered Inca city outside of Cusco, but it is in remarkably good state of preservation, and its architecture has not become confused with Spanish efforts to build churches and villas. If the theory here propounded is correct, that Machu Picchu was originally Tampu Tocco, from those 3 windows set out the tribes that eventually founded Cusco, the importance of Machu Picchu as the cradle of the later Inca race will of course be increased. It is not very profitable to speculate on the habits of these ancient people until we have more opportunity to study the finds made in the burial caves and to compare these with finds made in other parts of Peru. We know that they were masters of the art of stone cutting. We know they knew how to make bronze, and they had a considerable artistic sense, as evidenced by their workmanship. One of the bronze pins found at Machu Picchu has for a head the miniature reproduction of the head of a hummingbird, including a long curved bill. One bronze knife is decorated with the head of a llama, another with an Indian boy lying on his stomach with his heels in the air, playing tug-of-war with a large fish on the end of a little bronze rope. The workmen of Machu Picchu not only had skill, but originality and ingenuity. Their pottery is varied in form and attractive in its ornamentation. They understood how to plan great architectural and engineering works, and to carry them to a satisfactory conclusion. The soil of the terraces is extremely fertile, and the Inca utilized every square yard of available land within the radius of several miles. The 2 or 3 Indian families who have been living at Machu Picchu for the past 4 or 5 years have had no difficulty in raising good crops of sweet potato, corn, peppers, onions, tomatoes, and certain native vegetables unknown in this country. The only difficulty they have found is keeping down the superabundant tropical vegetation, which constantly threatens to suffocate their crops. As an instance of how rapidly this vegetation grows, terraces covered by bamboo cane, which we cleared in September, had to be re-cleared in November, when most of these pictures were taken. In the intervening 2 months, some of the cane had attained a height of 5 feet. It is my hope to prepare a special monograph on Machu Picchu for publication by the National Geographic Society. Alright, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this story. Go check out the Patreon. I've been posting some very interesting stuff there. Whenever I come across something interesting in my research, it goes right on the Patreon. So don't miss out on some of that stuff. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.